I told them. I was framed. The government framed me. They want me to disappear. I know too much.
Egypt. In the labyrinth of Cairo streets lives a man with a $1 million bounty on his head. He's not a terrorist, not a drug lord. He's a former minister, a hero of the revolution, and once the best friend of one of the 20th century's most brutal dictators. His name is Umar Muhayshi. Why did the CIA, mercenaries, and international intelligence agencies get tangled up in the hunt for him? This is a story of betrayal, ideology, and the price paid by those who challenge a dictatorship. Edwin Wilson officially left the CIA in 1971. He then worked for a time in the Office of Naval Intelligence, in a secret unit called the Naval Field Operations Support Group. Later, with another former CIA operative, Frank Terp, who was fired from the agency for misconduct. They created a lucrative business supplying various dictators with weapons, surveillance equipment, and paramilitary training services.
We worked for the government, you understand? It was just business. Nothing personal.
His main client was Muammar Gaddafi, to whom Wilson sold about 20 tons of C4 explosives. He also recruited former American Green Berets to train Libyan terrorists. Several years later, a judge who sentenced Terpil to 53 years in prison in absentia described their activities as trading in death and destruction. In 1976, Gaddafi offered them a $1 million contract. They were to eliminate his main enemy, a Libyan dissident of Circassian descent hiding in Egypt, Umar Muhayshi.
You know, Gaddafi offered $1 million. $1 million, bro. You know, this guy knows how to persuade.
The former agents accepted the contract, but Wilson knew that killing a high-ranking dissident in Cairo was a risky operation. He decided to hire subcontractors and turn to his old CIA contacts, anti-communist Cubans from Miami. These were hardened fighters, veterans of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. The key figure hired for the operation was Rafael Chichi Quintero. He and his two associates, the brothers Rafael and Raúl Villaverde, were experienced militants and ideological opponents of communism.
Quintero and the Villaverde brothers were the best, if you know what I mean, man. Real killers.
To entice them and justify the hefty fee, Wilson and Terpil resorted to a ruse. They told the Cubans that their real target was not some Libyan dissident, but the most dangerous international terrorist of the time, Ilyich Ramirez Sanchez, better known as Carlos the Jackal. At the time, Carlos, a Marxist revolutionary responsible for numerous terrorist attacks, including the 1975 raid on the OPEC headquarters in Vienna, was living in Libya under Gaddafi's protection. This made him an ideologically sound target for the anti-communist Cubans. The lie worked. Quintero and his team agreed to the mission to eliminate the terrorists.
Misurata, Libya.
The story of Umar Muhayshi is inextricably linked to the fate of Libya's Circassian diaspora, descendants of the Mamluks who served in the armies of Arab caliphs since the 9th century. They formed a small but visible community of about 30,000 people in Libya, living mainly in the cities of Misrata and Benghazi. Gaddafi and Muhayshi attended the military academy in Benghazi, where they and other comrades founded the underground Free Officers Movement. This group, modeled after the Egyptian organization that overthrew its monarchy in 1952, became the core of the plot that led to the bloodless coup and the overthrow of King Idris I on September 1st, 1969. The supreme power was handed over to the Revolutionary Command Council of 12 young officers. Gaddafi was the leader. Muhayshi was his right-hand man, Minister of Planning, and one of the architects of the new Libya. In the early years after the revolution, Muhayshi enjoyed great authority and influence in the RCC, being one of Gaddafi's most trusted confidants. However, the idyll in the relationship between the two allies didn't last long. As Gaddafi's power grew, his policies became increasingly authoritarian and ideological. Muhayshi, who held more pragmatic views, began to express his disagreement with the leader's course. The main point of contention was economic policy. Gaddafi directed Libya's vast oil revenues to support pan-Arab and anti-colonial movements around the world, as well as to implement his ambitious but often utopian projects. Muhayshi, as Minister of Planning, insisted on the need to invest in the country's development, in agriculture, industry, and especially in the creation of a metallurgical complex in his hometown of Misrata. These disagreements were not just a dispute over budget allocation. They reflected a fundamental conflict in the vision for Libya's future. Muhayshi sought to build a strong, economically developed state, while Gaddafi saw Libya as a staging ground for a global revolution. In one interview after his escape, Muhayshi called Gaddafi a dangerous psychopath, which testifies to the depth of their personal and ideological rift. By 1975, the conflict between Muhayshi and Gaddafi reached a boiling point. Convinced of the impossibility of changing Gaddafi's policy from within, Muhayshi and a group of other high-ranking officers began to plot a conspiracy to overthrow him. However, the conspiracy was uncovered. In August of that year, the Gaddafi regime announced that it had foiled an attempted coup. Most of the conspirators were arrested and later executed. Umar Muhayshi managed to avoid this fate. Warned of the plot's failure, he fled the country to neighboring Tunisia. His life in exile turned into a constant struggle for survival. He moved from one country to another, Tunisia, Egypt, Morocco, all the while remaining in the crosshairs of Libyan intelligence services. Gaddafi, who did not forgive betrayal, declared a real hunt for him. Geneva, Switzerland. The Cubans arrived in Switzerland, where they were to receive their final instructions and an advance payment. It was there that Wilson and Turpil revealed their cards and presented the militants with the true target, Umar Muhayshi, a political opponent of Gaddafi hiding in Egypt. Wilson thought the Cubans wouldn't care who they shot, as long as they got paid. But for Rafael Quintero and his men, this came as a complete surprise. They were ideological fighters, not hitmen willing to eliminate dissidents for money at the request of dictators. Realizing they had been deceived, the Cubans flatly refused to participate in the operation. Moreover, immediately upon returning to the United States, Quintero reported the plot to his former CIA handler.
Quintero sold me out to his old handler from the agency. That was the end.
This denunciation marked the beginning of the end for Edwin Wilson. The Department of Justice brought an indictment against him. Wilson moved to Libya and sought protection from Muammar Gaddafi. However, after some time, he was lured to the Caribbean, where he was immediately arrested, brought to New York, and ultimately sentenced to a long prison term for illegal arms and explosives trafficking, and for conspiring to murder prosecutors and witnesses. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat considered forming a Libyan government in exile under Muhayshi's leadership to fight the Gaddafi regime. However, after Muhayshi publicly condemned his 1979 visit to Jerusalem, the dissident's position became more difficult, and he was soon forced to move to Morocco. But in 1983, King Hassan II of Morocco, in exchange for Gaddafi's cessation of financial aid to the Polisario Front, fighting for the independence of Western Sahara, decided to hand Muhayshi over to the Libyan authorities. This was an act of state betrayal that cost the rebellious Circassian his life. In January 1984, Umar Abdullah al-Muhayshi was taken to Libya. There are different accounts of his final hours, but they all agree on one thing: his death was excruciating. According to one version, he was beaten to death with kicks right on the runway of the Tripoli airport. According to another, more common version, he died under torture in the infamous Abu Salim prison. The exact location of his burial is still unknown. Gaddafi thought he had won, but the brutal murder of Muhayshi was not forgotten, especially in his hometown of Misrata, especially among the Libyan Circassians. 27 years later, Misrata would become one of the main centers of the uprising that would overthrow Gaddafi. It also didn't help him that shortly before his overthrow in 2011, he asked Jordanian Circassians to influence their fellow tribesmen, but the seeds of anger sown in 1984 had already yielded a bloody harvest. In modern Libya, torn apart by internal conflicts, the memory of Umar Muhayshi is ambiguous. For some, he is a traitor who tried to overthrow the legitimate government. For others, he is a martyr, and one of the first who dared to challenge Gaddafi's dictatorship. Edwin Wilson claimed he was framed, and stated that he had been working for the CIA all along. Eventually, his lawyer was able to prove this. In October 2003, a federal judge overturned Wilson's conviction in the C4 explosives case. Journalist Eric Margolis called him the man in the iron mask of America, He believed Wilson was innocent and spoke with him many times in prison. "The government set me up," Wilson once told Margolis. "They want me to disappear." Edwin Wilson was released from prison in 2004 and died on September 10th, 2012. Rafael Villaverde went missing and was presumed dead when his boat exploded off the coast of Florida in April 1982. Frank Turpel was more fortunate. He managed to escape the US before the trial and was convicted in absentia. He hid in Lebanon, Syria, and eventually settled in Cuba, where he died in 2016.